Our top story, the war in Ukraine is taking a heavy toll, not just on Ukraine, but in fact all over the world. The disruption in supply chains, blockades of Ukrainian grain exports have worsened hunger in many parts of the world, especially the most vulnerable regions. Millions of civilians are unable to return home. Everyone wants to see a productive discussion now between Ukraine and Russia. Some hopes now of a possible relaxation of the aggressive war in the latest developments provide a sense of hope to millions. The Kremlin has said President Vladimir Putin is open to talks on a possible settlement to the conflict in Ukraine and believes in a diplomatic solution. The Kremlin's comments come a day after US President Joe Biden had suggested he was prepared to speak to the Russian leader. According to Biden, the only way to end the war in Ukraine is for Putin to pull his troops out, and that if Putin is looking to end the conflict, then Biden would be prepared to speak to him. Biden has also said the Russian president had miscalculated by invading Ukraine, and if that he's serious about getting out of Ukraine, then he would be willing to sit down with Putin after consultations with NATO allies.
Look, there's one way for this war to end, the rational way. Putin to pull out of Ukraine, number one. But it appears he's not going to do that. He's paying a very heavy price for failing to do it, but he's inflicting incredible carnage on the civilian population of Ukraine, bombing nurseries, hospitals, children's homes. It's sick what he's doing. But the fact of the matter is, I have no immediate plans to contact Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin is, let me choose my words very carefully. I'm prepared to speak with Mr. Putin if, in fact, there is an interest in him deciding he's looking for a way to end the war.
Meanwhile, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has called on Russian President Vladimir Putin to seek a diplomatic solution to end the war and also urged withdrawal of troops. Berlin says the two leaders spoke over the phone. The developments come as heavy fighting continues in the east of Ukraine. Earlier, Putin had said he had no regrets about launching what he called Russia's special military operation against Ukraine. Ukraine and the West say Putin has no justification for the war of occupation. Ukraine says it will fight until the last Russian soldier is ejected from its territory. For more on this story, we earlier spoke to our correspondent Susan Tehrani, who's in New York.
It was very interesting, and it came shortly and side by side, really, with the French President Emmanuel Macron, and shortly after that really long closed-door meeting between the two Western leaders. And you know, one can't help but wonder whether or not Macron really expressed concern about the problems that Europe is facing right now with the long winter haul and energy supplies due to this Russian invasion on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we did hear immediately afterwards the Russian president come out and say that he's willing to negotiate, not on the terms of the West, but if, for example, if Joe Biden and the West agree to recognize territories, quote unquote, seized by Russia. You know, a lot of experts and analysts said that ultimately, if there is going to be some kind of a ceasefire or a breakthrough, then those parts of the Donbass region will have to be up for negotiation and discussion. The likelihood that Putin and his forces will pull back is very unlikely. So we'll have to wait and see, but it does seem like there is a glimmer of hope, just because right now Europe is in an extremely tough situation regarding energy. On the one hand, as you rightly noted in your introduction, in the narration as well, that the energy crunch is real, food supply chain issues. And here in the United States, you know, it becomes a domestic issue. The Democrats are really feeling the heat as well. And then the money that's going into Ukraine, you know, from Capitol Hill, you know, that's coming up for discussion as well, with the Republicans taking over at least the House. So I think it was calculated, it was measured, the comments that Joe Biden was making.
Significant developments, those to deconstruct the statements by Putin and Biden. We're now joined by Maximilian Haas, a Russia-Ukraine analyst. Thanks so much, Mr. Haas, for speaking to WION. Now, President Biden says if Putin is serious about ending the war, I'm willing to sit down with him and talk. The Kremlin says President Putin is open to talks on Ukraine and believes in a diplomatic solution, even as he insists that attacks on infrastructure in Ukraine will continue. The question really is there a glimmer of hope here? Is there an end to the war somewhere in sight, or would that be too optimistic of you?
Thank you for having me. Certainly there is no end to this war in sight. Vladimir Putin's position has not changed. That same rhetoric has been emanating from the Kremlin since the beginning of the war. And as his press spokesperson said today, Russia would only be willing to entertain these negotiations if the West and Ukraine recognize its territorial assertions. Now, remember, Russia claims to have annexed all of the Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk regions. They don't control the entire territory of any of those regions. And of course, just earlier at the beginning of last month, on the 11th of November, they lost control of the city of Kherson itself, the only regional capital that they had taken. So the Russian forces are still very much on the back foot, although fighting is likely to not see as many large territorial gains now with the onset of winter, although both armies are fairly capable of fighting in those environments. But also the economic war between Russia and the international community is also ongoing.
All right. So you are certainly skeptical about these statements that have been made, especially those emanating from the Kremlin. Now, the trouble is that there is no change to the entrenched positions on the two sides. Kiev maintains that the only way the war can end is if the last Russian soldier leaves their land, whereas Putin is hell-bent on having the world, including the West, recognize the annexation of Ukrainian territory by Moscow. And therefore, the trouble is that, is this stalemate really going to continue, or is there any possibility that the two sides could show some sort of flexibility going forward?
Well, I think it really is beholden on the Russians to show flexibility. Of course, this is a war of aggression that they've committed countless human rights violations. They are seeking to unilaterally annex Ukrainian territory without the support of the local population. Despite these sham referenda they've held, we've seen the celebrations in Kherson upon its liberation and how Ukrainian soldiers were welcomed, whereas the local population, although there were some collaborators, many of them also took part in partisan warfare and information sharing with the Ukrainian army to help them retake that city. So the reality is that Putin is very much on the back foot. His armies are not advancing and in fact are still losing in some territory in Luhansk, and there's a concern that they may lose more in Zaporizhia as well. So the Ukrainians will be hoping that they can push the Russians back all the way back to the 24th of February lines, where they controlled only a small portion of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, as well as, of course, Crimea, which they annexed in 2014, also against international law. So the Ukrainians will be looking to get to that stage when they negotiate. The Kremlin is also very weak economically. They face a real sort of dire outlook with the oil price cap coming in as well, and the sanctions continue to bite and constrain their ability to spend money and grow their economy and trade abroad. So they still see the advantages on their side. Putin recognizes that this is an existential fight for him. Having launched this war, he knows it may be very difficult for him to remain in power if he surrenders. So I don't know if we'll see his calculations change until it gets to that real crisis moment for him.
All right. Well, at the moment, certainly there seems to be no room for flexibility going by at least Russia's actions so far. There is nothing the world would want to see more than an end to this war. But does that continue to be a pipe dream? That is the big question. Thank you so much, Maximilian Haas, for speaking to WION.
Thank you for having me.